session of the day, concurrent session of the day. My name is Dr. Sacoby McGill Wilson. You may have heard me speaking in the last session, but really excited to be here on this session entitled Justice40, How to Energize Your Community. So this session is going to run from 11:10 to 12:30. So we're gonna have a good discussion today. We have a couple speakers who will get into some of these issues that are very important. We have Mark Magana, who's going to speak, who's the founding president and CEO Green Latinos, a national network of Latino environmental conservation advocates. He's the first Latino to have served as senior staff at both the White House and congressional leadership as special assistant to President Clinton for White House legislative affairs and senior policy advisor to the House Democratic Caucus, Vice Chair Robert Menendez. And then we have today our second esteemed panelist is Jackie Patterson, founder, executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. If you don't know about the Chisholm Legacy Project, look it up. You know who is named, please look it up. This is part of your history, folks. Jackie is the founder of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The mission of the project is rooted in a just transition framework, serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front lines of climate justice with the resources to actualize visions. Prior to the launch of this project, Jackie served as the senior director of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. So let's go with our first speaker. Who's up first?
I'll go ahead. Jackie
Yes,
pushed
sir.
me to the front.
Go ahead, Mark.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson and good friend Jackie Patterson. Both of you are heroes of mine who I've admired for your skills, abilities, wisdom, and the work that you've done throughout the years on this issue, even when this issue wasn't at the forefront as it is now. And I'm glad to be honored to be on this panel with you. My name is Mark Magana. I am the founding president and CEO of Green Latinos. We are a nationwide comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx, environmental and conservation champions. We come together as individuals across different sectors of the movement, Latinos in big green groups, Latinos in frontline, EJ, academia, foundations, renewable energy, corporate sustainability, community civil rights, to be able to build relationships, to break down historical barriers between the different sectors of the movement so that we can build partnerships and share our unique resources, access, power, privilege, information that we each have, so that we can each other both professionally, but more importantly, we can use those resources to help our communities to achieve their environmental liberation. So, some actors won't work with animals. I generally do not work with slides, but I heard from Jackie as well late last night, created 2 slides for you. So they are going to amplify the great work of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform at the end of my presentation. So instead, I'm going to start with a short story. I grew up in the LA area in the 1970s. I know. I looked much younger than that, but it was the hot 70s. And my community was surrounded in a triangle by the 405, the 605, and the 22 freeways, all within a mile. And as a child in LA, we would, in the morning, we'd get the air report on the radio. And it would tell us whether it was safe to go outside and play for children and older people. To be able to listen to whether or not it's safe for a child to have to wait and listen to see if it's safe outside. Not that it really mattered because we played outside every day. But we'd hear in the air report that it wasn't safe to go outside that day, to play, to be. And we'd go outside and several of our friends would have to take breaks from playing. We'd always have to take timeouts to take their inhaler because of asthma. But we didn't think anything of it. We just thought that was the normal. And if a child was really suffering, we knew the closest house to run them to be able to either get their inhaler or to get their parents to take care of them. And we thought that was normal. It is not, and that situation hasn't changed. LA's air has gotten a little bit better for many of our communities. Children are dying of asthma. We are on the front lines of this situation, and it can't just be seen as normal. And now I have two of my own children, age 7 and 9, and Dios si quiere, they don't have asthma. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a situation financially where I can afford to buy some organic foods, to have air purifiers in the house, to have water purifiers on the sink, in the fridge. But it shouldn't have to be that way, that we have to pay the same corporations that are poisoning our air, our water, our land, more money to have clean water and clean air and clean food. Mi abuela, my grandmother, if she were alive today and looking at me and seeing how much we spend for these luxuries, would be beside herself. She would say, do you know what we used to call organic food, mijo? We used to call it food. We didn't used to poison our land, our air, our water. We respected it. Nowadays, you say we don't shit where we eat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this just paints one picture of the historical context around which some communities have been and are being given up as sacrifice zones so that other more wealthy communities can thrive. And this gives the reason why we need to make sure that Justice40 is going to the right communities and serving them well. It's clear that Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, and all communities across the nation disproportionately bear the brunt of climate change and environmental injustices, from air, water, land pollution, to living in communities more vulnerable to climate-driven catastrophes. All of this on top of economic and health disparities. The fact that the COVID pandemic has disproportionately harmed and killed our communities, and now we're suffering through a shaky and unequal economic recovery as prices are skyrocketing and our communities are reporting that they can't afford food. Our communities are resilient, but come on. We're hurting right now. And the stakes for this moment are literally life or death. Latinos in the U.S., as I mentioned, often impacted by a broad burden of health, economic, social, and political disparities and disenfranchisement due to immigration status and other forms of marginalization, including language issues, have largely been excluded from decision-making tables that shape the outcomes of their lives. This is happening as communities of color, rural communities, frontline communities across the nation are being affected by the environmental injustices and policies that continue to put fossil fuel corporate profits over the health and safety of communities. In a couple of hours, the House is going to vote for final passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This is a groundbreaking bill, but it is marred significantly by the many negative provisions and giveaways to the fossil fuel industry to allow them to continue to drill and poison our communities for decades to come. No one's hands are clean on this bill. It is significant investments in clean energy and our future, but at the cost to our communities. And these policies that have for decades plagued our communities and impact our health and our future and our economic potential. And for any of us who thought those days were over, where we weren't going to be targeted, where we weren't going to be hit hard, it's still happening. 54% of Latinos in the U.S. live in California, Texas, and Florida, states that have experienced increasingly destructive extreme weather events fueled by climate change. This summer is going to be the most pleasant summer in your memory if we don't stand up and take action now. The southeast of the U.S. is home to some of the fastest growing Latino communities and represents a region with increasingly dangerous heat exposure that is likely to drive further vector-borne disease and other serious public impacts that we're going to see. Puerto Rico, home to over 3 million people, has already begun to see the impacts of increasingly severe storm seasons. You remember the Hurricane Maria knocking out energy and power for some for over a year. Imagine being out without electricity for that long of time. And the devastating consequences that these things have on our health, our infrastructure, and our economic potential. We must remain absolutely cognizant of a long history of systemic racism and lack of inclusion of Latinos from the mainstream environmental movement, compounded by 4 years of the Trump administration, racist and anti-environmental policies, has led to a new call for environmental liberation, one that transcends political parties, presidents, and partisanship. Today, the fight for environmental liberation, liberación ambiental, cannot succeed without critical community-centered leadership that is resourced to win the fight for environmental justice. This is all why implementing Justice40 well is so important. During his campaign, Joe Biden and his VP Kamala Harris pledged to target 40% of federal climate investments for under-resourced communities that have suffered far too long from environmental inequities. The president's whole-of-government approach in addressing climate justice through the creation of programs like Justice40 are critical for addressing the extreme disempowerment and unequal effects our communities feel, especially strong coming out from the climate crisis. The groundbreaking Making Justice40 a Reality for Frontline Communities report, which we hope to fine-tune with several members of this panel, elevated solid policy experience and research that has guided a significant achievement for this administration. The report provides federal agencies with a roadmap to design and implement an equitable Justice40 and deliver on the Biden administration's top priorities. The priorities include providing economic relief, tackling climate change, and advancing racial equity, civil rights, and environmental justice. Beyond shedding light on the persistent environmental inequities that devastate underserved, historically neglected communities, the recommendations are guiding the Biden-Harris administration and implementing agencies with a comprehensive analysis of state experiences, do's and don'ts, and tangible policy recommendations to help fulfill this major campaign promise. The vision for the Justice40 initiative is centered on environmental, racial, and economic justice, with focus on frontline communities that have been systemically impacted by pollution, underinvestment, poverty, and other inequities. And we know that achieving a transition from an extractive, carbon-based economy to a clean, renewable, and regenerative economy that can sustain support for growth and prosperity for our nation and our people is no small feat. And doing so in a way that ensures none of us are left behind is an even greater but necessary undertaking. So it is critical to center the voices of environmental justice communities during this process. We believe Justice40 is a program with a lot of potential, but the devil's in the details, and strong implementation is critical. The federal government should be intentional in its spending. The Justice40 initiative requires government agencies to make recommendations on how certain federal investments might be made towards a goal that 40% of the overall benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. But important issues remain, like defining benefits to disadvantaged communities is deeply programmatic. Frontline communities have pushed for a dollar spent metric, since that is much more tangible of a metric than benefits. Let me make it clear that we prefer to be talking about the original idea that was presented by the administration, which was 40% of investments going to frontline communities rather than 40% of the benefits from investment language that we have seen transition to, which is a much more difficult standard to track. So this percentage must be considered a floor, not a ceiling. The 40% also needs to be better defined and understood. What overall bucket of spending are we talking about exactly to determine the 40%? We are concerned by the failure to use race as an indicator in the CEQ tool, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, to identify disadvantaged communities. This is a problem for our communities. How are we supposed to address environmental racism if race isn't accounted for directly? It's also important to note, and I mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again, that despite the good stuff that we find in the IRA, we are deeply concerned about the potential significant harms that this significant bill might have on our community. And Justice40 is just one of the tools to make sure that the EJ priorities that might save us from the worst of these effects are front and center. But it's going to take more than just executive action. It's going to take congressional action, including passing the Environmental Justice for All Act, to push back on the troubling components in the IRA, especially those around fossil fuel extraction. So ensuring that more protections for environmental justice and frontline communities, and recognizing the cumulative impacts of pollution are codified into law. We must ensure that our frontline communities lead in the identification and the meeting of our own needs. These decisions need to be made at the community level, where the knowledge and lived experience should shape the Justice40 initiative and its targeted investments to effectively and equitably meet the needs of frontline and historically under-resourced communities. Many of our members have significant hurdles or limitations that are preventing access to communities that most need these resources. So investing in systematic technical assistance and capacity building is a must to build power for frontline communities. Our members and their own organizations, very few, even now, are prepared to take government contracts or grants. It's a very complicated process filled with legal issues and extensive compliance issues. If the organizations who've been working with and within these frontline communities for years are not prepared for Justice40, then well-funded fly-by-night operations will open up and come in and scoop up those federal dollars, claiming they represent these communities. And again, we will not receive the investments, just some of the trickle-down benefits. Clear investment objectives and guiding principles, funding criteria, and requirements or guidelines will be instrumental in ensuring successful implementation, with accountability mechanisms taking a step further, asking for transparency on appropriate level reporting and evaluation to ensure that objectives are met. It's important to note that Justice40 is not intended to and will not solve everything. We must couple it with the statutes, regulations, and enforcing the current laws in the books. We need to institutionalize equity and justice into all government agencies, practices, policies, and systems at every level. And we can go to the first slide I mentioned. As I conclude, I do want to take a moment to recognize the great work from the members of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. What they have done to pull together and release the Justice40 resource guide and funding finder. Please take a snap of this page and go to those sites. They just released it this month, but it answered a lot of questions for me on how you get involved in the resource guide, and then most especially the funding finder. These all have given communities and other stakeholders the information that they really desperately need to support successful Justice40 implementation in their communities. The guide and funding finder, an easy-to-use online search platform, identified roughly 400 federal agency programs that fall under the Justice40 initiative, including those funded through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and soon the IRA. They share information on how to access programs, funding, and direct advocacy efforts to improve Justice40 outcomes. Next slide, please. The EJNCP has also released its list of items this administration must do now to conclude implementing Justice40, some of which I mentioned already. Number one, launch the Environmental Justice Scorecard with agency methods for calculating and tracking community benefits. That must be transparent. Update the CEJST to address stakeholder comments and release the final version of the tool. And that includes using race. Release a full list of federal agency Justice40 programs. That still hasn't been released. Issue final White House Justice40 implementing guidelines for federal agencies. Provide more technical support and capacity building to local governments and community groups representing disadvantaged communities so they can successfully apply for federal grants. This is so important. Simplify grant application processes to make federal funds more accessible to disadvantaged communities. And work with state governors and agencies and local governments and community groups to support the delivery of Justice40 funding to communities that need it the most. And finally, strengthen federal programs to maximize the benefits to delivery to disadvantaged communities and avoid harms such as increased pollution or community displacement. We must build upon the significant frontline climate and justice leaders to highlight the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis has on Latino and other frontline communities across the country to ensure that our community's priorities, our community's ideas, our community's solutions are elevated, protected, and invested in. And so we look forward to working with our elected and appointed leaders across the country to incorporate these critical priorities into all our communities. Finally, looking to Colorado as an example, where I live now in Boulder, Colorado, the land of the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. We have a couple of examples of how Justice40 program has worked and how it has stumbled. Some groups who have been serving the community for a long time, groups like Groundwork Denver. They've been directly served and employed Latinos in Colorado and their most polluted communities have successfully received funding where they're hiring 20 workers in South Commerce City, Globeville, Elyria, and Swansea to educate the community about local environmental justice issues and environmental advocacy and stewardship. Train them to effectively outreach to discuss energy efficiency with residents and how to plant and maintain trees on their property. Doing door-to-door outreach, education. But for every one of these Groundwork Denver organizations, there are dozens of organizations that were not able to get funding that were not able to apply for funding, that didn't have the ability, the team, the back office to be able to apply for Justice40 funding. We also saw Justice40 funding go to newer, brand new orgs in our community that just popped up. The great projects in the historical groups in our communities shouldn't be struggling to apply. We need to educate our communities to access these resources better. So while Justice40 and other tools important to improve our process as we move forward, we truly need action now, and we must stand together and fight for the environmental liberation that our communities so strongly need at this moment. I'm excited to hear from Jackie. I know she's going to cover a lot of great things, and I hope I stretched long enough, Jackie, and you have the time to be able to really cover the important issues that you and the organization are doing. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great presentation. Appreciate all the discussion about what's happened with Latinos, Latinx communities, populations across the country, and your recommendations. Really great for the attendees. Now I'll pass the mic to Jackie to follow up and talk about what your organization is doing, and again how we can get Justice40 and make sure we can energize our communities. Go ahead, Jackie.
Thank you so much. I'm going to really kind of focus in. I'm moving away from saying drill down. So we know drilling isn't necessarily the best thing to do, but I'm going to focus in more intensely on one particular point from Mark's last slide, which is the one on engaging state and local governments to support the communities that need it the most. And I'm going to really give us some illustrative examples of some of those communities and the ways that we need to position these resources to ensure that as Sacoby said, those communities are energized. So first I want to say thank you, as always, to Sacoby for organizing this critical conversation and pulling together these great folks to have critical dialogue around the ways forward. I'm honored to share this panel with Mark, as I'm always honored to share space with him, and just finding both Sacoby and Mark to be just so inspirational, and always learn every single time I'm in space with you all. And behind the scenes, thanks to Simone Stevens, who's been just so gracious in helping us to make sure that we're all here and ready and looking ready to share with you all. So I am going to also share a few slides here to help to illustrate the points here. Hopefully you can see them. Okay, good. That looks better. All right. So as I haven't been we as the Chisholm Legacy Project haven't been as deeply engaged on Justice40 as there are so many great folks who are, and our one place that we have been deeply engaged is trying to ensure that the communities that are farthest to the margins, literally the furthest to the margins, are that there's pathways for these communities to be served by Justice40. So as Mark says, the communities that need it the most. So I'm going to just provide some illustrative ways that these communities can and should be engaged. And so just giving a sense of what a couple of the communities are. Randolph, Arizona is a community that was a freedman settlement. It's historically Black populated community in Pinal County, Arizona. It was founded by a fellow named Epes Randolph, but the community really was populated historically by the increased need, due to the increased need for agricultural workers that arose during the late 1920s. And so hundreds of farm workers migrated to the area in the 1930s. And many of the folks who settled in Randolph were Black migrants from Oklahoma. And so this community really was a community where Black people fled from the Jim Crow laws in states like Arkansas and Oklahoma to find work in the cotton fields in Pinal County. One of the fathers of one of the residents there, Ron Jordan, said that they were told that you come out to Arizona and go to work, and it's like money laying on the ground. And the purpose of it was that they could pick cotton and that the people were free. So it was with that backdrop that people really came and settled in Pinal County, Arizona, in a place called that was came to be known as Randolph. Over the years, it's people have moved out to find better employment opportunities because, as with all of the communities I'll be talking about a little bit, that it's an area that, of course, when you have the predominance of Black folks, then there's underinvestment that happens, and you see it's kind of two things that happened with Black communities that were settled back then. Either they were just kind of systematically starved of the resources that they needed to really survive, much less thrive, or people torched those communities, as you heard with the Greenwood situation and the Tulsa race massacre. And that was kind of the most notable one that we all hear about. But there are other communities that, as soon as they're started to, if the efforts to starve the communities and until they atrophied weren't successful, and if communities managed to rise and thrive in spite of those efforts, then those communities were systematically torched by people who were seeking to make sure that Black folks did not survive, much less thrive. And so this is one of the communities where it didn't rise to the extent that it needed from those folks' estimation to be vanquished in that way. And so it just kind of limped along, and it did begin to atrophy in terms of people moving away. And so fast forward to today. Recently, we were involved there because there was a gas plant. There's a gas plant that's there owned by the Salt River Project, and the company was looking to expand it from 12 gas turbines to adding 16 more, so a total of 28. And so already the community was having health impacts from that they directly tied to this gas turbines that were there, and there is and so they really fought against it. But it was another one of those David and Goliath situations where the Salt River Project really invested a lot in trying to make sure that the community didn't have weren't successful. And with the municipality and others seeing it as a cash cow for them, because they by their estimate, they would pay, Salt River Project would pay over $76 million in property taxes by 2033. But that money wouldn't go to the community that's right against it, that would be most impacted by it. So 10 million goes to the city of Coolidge, 31 million to the Coolidge Unified Schools, 11 million to Central Arizona College, 18 million to Pinal County writ large, but nothing that's particularly dedicated to the community that's choking down the fumes, that's facing the risk of what would happen if there was a disaster that impacted that gas plant. The good news is that in that case, the community was able to rise up and fight. There were entities that came in, including pro bono legal support. This woman named Diane Post just put her life aside and was all in on helping them. And they were able to be successful in fighting that permit. And so that is a victory to be celebrated. But unfortunately, the situation is that too often these are the communities that this is the circumstances of the communities that they are atrophied to such an extent that when these threats come in, it's hard for them to fight them. So this was a unique story. So I wanted to kind of start us off on what's possible when communities do have the type of investment that they need to be able to fight off threats to their health and well-being. But we really want to move beyond just kind of community being capacitated to fight the constant threats that come to communities being capacitated to not just kind of fill needs or to repel toxins, but to actually be able to thrive, to have what they need to be able to fulfill dreams. And so this is really the task before us. So everyone else not everyone else, but others get to talk about the American dream, and our communities too often are just trying to be able to get from day to day. Another community that we work in is Sand Branch, Texas, which is 14 miles outside of Dallas. And so this community has been without drinkable water since the 1980s. And again, it's 14 miles outside of one of the richest cities in the world, certainly in the nation. And it is annexed by Dallas County, again, a very wealthy county, but yet again, they're not afforded the access to the very basic human right of water since the 1980s. And so Sand Branch was established in the late 1878. And it was established by 11 people who came there, again, a similar story, who were emancipated from enslavement and came there from Louisiana, again, seeking to settle land and be able to provide for themselves and for their progeny. And so that community since then had their water contaminated in the 1980s. They were on well water, and since then they've been dependent on bottles of donated water. And so they've had a situation where they were also declared to be in a floodplain, even though it's like a 1% floodplain, 1% chance of flooding. But still, any designation of floodplain gives this, provides, I guess, in this circumstance, the opportunity for the county to be able to say that no new buildings can be done there, that that people can't improve on their household circumstances. So you have houses like the house on the left that is in such disrepair, but yet people feel like, and this is also an information challenge, that people feel like they aren't able to make repairs. I think there are ways that you can do it, but there's signs all over talking about permits. There's always people riding through the town for permit enforcement to make sure that people aren't doing improvements on their homes. And on top of it all, because it was declared to be in a floodplain, then the buyout program then came to town. And with the buyout program, people were encouraged strongly to sell their property, and many of them did. And there were circumstances where people were given an appraisal of how much their property was worth. And again, without those improvements, with no running water, with no trash pickup, with no sewage system, then they weren't able to, then their property values were pretty low. And then they assessed the amount it would take them to demolish the home on the property. Again, it's almost punishing them for having to leave by like charging them for the demolishing of their homes, and because they're in this 1% flood designation. And so they subtract that amount from this already low appraisal, and they're giving people checks for $350 for homes and land that have been in their family for generations and generations. So I wish I could see you all, because I'm sure you're as shocked and appalled as I am by that. I've said it a zillion times, but every time I say it, I feel it in my heart, in my soul, in my stomach, the level of injustice with that situation. And so Sand Branch, it's a situation where there's just assault on assault in terms of their ability to just survive, much less thrive in that circumstance. It's called Sand Branch because the area has a lot of sand, and it's a place where there was a lot of sand mining and so forth. So as a result, surrounding the community are a number of cement kilns that they use to create bricks and brick and just cement that goes to other places to be laid. And so there's trucks coming through all the time. So the near road air pollution from the main road there. And then there's also the cement kilns themselves and the air pollution that comes from those. And then on top of it all, since there's no trash pickup, the way that they deal with the trash, thank you, Sister Marva, it is awful and appalling. The way that they deal with the trash is that they're burning that trash and those kind of steel drums in their backyards. So every day they have these mini incinerators operating throughout the town that are burning household waste, including those cases and cases of water bottles that they use for their eating, their drinking, their sanitation, and so forth. So again, I could just really go on about the Sand Branch situation, but I just wanted to really help you to understand that, for those who don't already know and experience with these communities, that this is not just limited to Sand Branch. This is just an illustrative example of too many communities that have been allowed to be in these circumstances in a place, in a land of plenty. I mean, this notion of there isn't enough to go around, this false notion of scarcity is a myth. We know that there is abundance. It's the distribution that's the problem. This is the ultimate case of distributional equity at its absolute worst. So, like I said, it's a illustrative tales at scale, and we're undertaking a project to really look at the freedmen settlements throughout the country, and specifically looking at freedmen settlements because A, as Sacoby said, we are about Black liberation, but B, because they are uniquely unincorporated areas often, or in those kind of two scenarios I talked about, and they're just there's little known about them in so many cases. So we want to make sure that we are engaging with these communities. And so these are just a few of the illustrative kind of examples of communities that are in these circumstances, from Arizona to North Carolina to Pennsylvania to more in Texas, many in Texas, Indiana, Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama, literally nationwide. And so we're still kind of looking at these different communities and their situations, as well as looking at the community, its socioeconomic status, and also looking at the climate risk and the environmental injustice risk in those communities. In the DMV area, we have places like Bacontown in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, which is a former freedmen settlement, Rossville in Prince George's County, which is a former freedmen settlement, Unionville in Talbot County, again, a former freedmen settlement. We haven't done all the data analysis on these places, but just sharing that these communities are everywhere. In Delaware, these are a few communities, again, that we haven't looked at because there's so many to look at, and we've been looking at the ones that have come to us so far. But in Delaware, Belltown, Star Hill, Charlietown, Polktown, I don't know if folks know these places. And in Virginia, there are these and more: Truxton, Hobson Settlement, Carey's Chapel Road, Pocahontas Island, interestingly enough, Middlesex County, Freedmen's Village, Titustown, Rushmere, and so many more. And so for me, this is like a call to consciousness. The common conditions for freedmen settlements include just really uplifting that they're founded by those whose enslaved labor built the infrastructure for this nation. So as we talk about Justice40, we talk about the infrastructure bill, I mean, to call it irony seems just too mild, that the folks who built the infrastructure in the first place are the communities that are least likely to receive the resources and the help from these initiatives. I haven't seen any sign of any concerted effort to identify and serve these communities that are off the map. So they're unincorporated, so many of them. They suffer from municipal underbounding, where, again, the municipality doesn't provide them the basic services. They're politically disenfranchised. I won't name names in terms of some of these exact communities, but a lot of these policymakers write off these communities because they don't necessarily see them as coming to vote for them. And again, with that political disenfranchisement, it's well justified that folks don't necessarily engage in a political system that has utterly failed them, not only at the county level, the state level, but at the federal level, whether it's been Ford or Carter or Reagan or the Clintons, Clinton, the Bushes, certainly Trump, and even President Obama. The Sand Branch has not changed one whit from any federal program in all of those decades upon decades. They haven't changed at all and benefited at all from any of these federal programs. So it's not just, so the political disenfranchisement means that is both in terms of them not being impacted or benefiting from the political system, and therefore what motivation do people have to engage in a political system that is thoroughly failing these communities? So the environmental assaults and the ongoing risks are there in these communities. The persistent poverty, the varying access to the commons, again, basics like water. That's one thing I found consistently with so many of these communities, is the lack of access to water. And so what will Justice 40 do for these communities is the question that I ask. The work that we're doing now is to really help to pave those pathways for groups like Sand Branch to be able to be involved in Justice 40. So we're doing these monthly town hall meetings now, to really engage, pull the community together and help them to form their own pathway, to form their own self-determination, and then connecting them to these resources. So this is an image of one of the town hall meetings. With that, we are we're doing a town hall. I mean, a timeline of what's happened in the community, because many of the communities don't even know the rich history there, and often there's kind of descendants that are part of the community, but too often the community doesn't have the descendants who are there to continue still telling the story. We've developed this resource plan to help them to kind of think about how can they access water, how can they change the floodplain designation, how can they really secure their land ownership. And then we've actually started to bring actual resources. So thanks to the work of Reverend Leo Woodbury, the community was introduced to hydro panels so they can actually start to generate their own water. And so I'll wrap with this call to action. We need to support groups like the Texas Freedom Colonies project, to map and document the conditions of freedmen settlements nationwide. We have to capacitate groups like them and others to overlay environmental and climate risk and impact data. We have to wake up to the realities of political disenfranchisement of unincorporated communities and others, and build mechanisms to ensure that they can access resources like Justice 40. And with that, we have to, it's incumbent upon our federal agencies to build customized pathways for engaging with the most disenfranchised communities, in addition to the other disadvantaged communities. And one of the things we're advocating for is federal designation and protections for the freedmen settlements. So that is me in a nutshell, and I think we're going to have a little bit of discussion.
Oh, thank you for that great presentation, Jackie. Simone, can you please take questions out of the chat from the attendees and also add them to our private chat, please? But I want to go to a question for Jackie real quick. I think it's important, and this connects to Mark's presentation as well. You're talking about there's a lot of communities that are unincorporated, and I like to say that unincorporated communities in this country they deal with contamination without representation. So you look at our indigenous brothers and sisters reservations. Some of those areas are unincorporated. Folks, the colonials, right, Mark, the border area, those folks are incorporated. And then you touched upon, Jackie, the fact that folks don't have access to basic amenities. 20%, I think, our country still lives in rural areas. So a lot of those folks don't have access to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure. Can you just dig into that? Both of y'all dig into that issue of not having the human right to water and sewer, and in fact, we have so many people in this country who don't have access to it. And then what are some of those programs that are out there that could be energized by Justice 40, or energized by the infrastructure bill, or energized by the Inflation Reduction Act with all its flaws, to make sure those folks get access to sewer and water infrastructure?
Thank you. I will let Mark start on that if you don't mind. I'll just recover a little bit.
Yeah. Sorry, Jackie. Go ahead, Mark.
I mean, I think the issue of that you bring up, and thanks for bringing up the colonias, they are often unheard from and not talked about, but there are huge communities along the U.S.-Mexico border, primarily in Texas, that have been suffering from immense lack of infrastructure. And so with the ability for the Justice 40 initiative to take some of the money from the infrastructure bill that we passed to improve safe drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in those communities would be massive. I mean, it's 2022, and we have, like you mentioned, communities that don't have indoor plumbing, that don't have access to clean water. That seems like it's unimaginable in our country, but it's real and it's happening, and it hasn't changed yet. We also have the issue of old, corroded lead pipelines that are poisoning our children and damaging their brains and their ability to thrive and succeed and how that has gone unchecked in many of our urban communities, while the communities fully know that the water is shit, that you can't drink it. They know that. But the electeds choose to go the cheapest route. They choose to go the route that is of least resistance for their funders. And this infrastructure investment, this significant infrastructure investment that Congress has passed, must go into our communities, not just as trickle down benefits on the side, but real investment. And Colonias is a great place to start. So thanks for mentioning that.
Okay, Jackie, you recovered a little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add except to say that, when we complement the resources that are available through, again, the many flawed pieces of legislation that are moving forward, and the historic ones, with efforts like Justice40 that says, okay, there's this infrastructure bill, there's this IRA, and here are what's supposed to be pathways to ensure that the communities that need the most have access. But the problem is that the good thing is that we have initiatives like these various accelerator programs that are coming on that are able to help to translate, to understand enough about these various initiatives to be able to piece them together and translate how they can actually pave pathways for our communities. So whether it's the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice or the Solutions Project or others that have these accelerator pathways to get the communities that need it the most on the path. So that's promising, and we need to make sure that those groups are resourced to be able to do that to the highest high, and that there is still investment by federal agencies to understand those and pave those pathways themselves. So we need both. So that's what I would say.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So just to kind of dig in, so we talk about Justice40, and I have a question here. If you look at in the chat, it's Justice40 came from executive order. So what do we need to do to make sure that this Justice40 framework is durable, that it's sustainable, that it doesn't get, political winds change, whatever can happen in the fall or in the future, that we still have it to use as a framework. What are your thoughts about that? I'm not sure, Mark, you want to go to that question?
Yeah, very quickly. I mentioned the importance to codify environmental justice protections, and one such bill, the Environmental Justice for All bill, introduced by Chairman Grijalva from Arizona, and many of the communities you mentioned, Jackie, has long represented and protected and fought for. Chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, really strives to make sure that we're addressing the cumulative impacts of the various toxins and poisons and environmental degradation that's attacking our communities all at the same time, instead of just saying we can only look at one. What's that one thing? How's that one thing hurting you? Okay, now how's this one thing hurting you? Instead of saying, okay, how are these 10 things affecting you on the cumulative? And let's address that together. It's unbelievable that they're not doing that already. And so codifying a bunch of the environmental justice provisions that have been done executively is going to be important. And then to be able to make sure that funding stays at a high level, that this becomes a tradition, not a one-off, is going to be vital. But that has to be codified in legislation, but it also has to be something our community understands, accepts, utilizes, and demands. And so make it part of what we demand. We're not used to receiving shit from the government. And so for some people, there's massive distrust. There's massive, people saying, is not going to work. They're lying to us. And I understand why. But if we don't utilize this, if we don't take advantage of this, if we don't help use it to improve our communities, then it's not something that our communities are going to insist be maintained. So the other aspect is the public pressure on top of that.
Thank you for that. And just to add to the question a little bit, um, so we had the EJ for All Act, as Mark mentioned, but what about Jackie, opportunities to take, Justice 40 of relevant legislation funding wise and push the states to pass stuff, right? To get some things passed at the state level, right? So can
Mhm.
you just add to what Mark just shared with us?
Yeah, I definitely. So one of the things that that often happens when we're dealing with FEMA, for example, after a disaster, they will say, that this is how the money is flowing, and the decisions need to be made by the states, and that they don't have any control over how the money is allocated. So we know, for example, with Puerto Rico, and the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, that as they built back with a fossil fuel. They're talking about building back with a fossil fuel infrastructure, and the community is pushing to build back with a fossil free infrastructure, and
Mhm.
so that struggle continues, and and so we need to make sure, as to Mark's last point, that we have an energized set of communities to push the states to make the right decision, but energized and empowered. And I think that the energizing at scale is going to be critical to build a power to actually be able to influence the states to do the right thing. So I think that's critical in terms of building the community power. And this is one of the reasons, that for our work that we're even doing with Sam Branch, that hasn't been impacted, and so therefore not necessarily motivated to engage around some of these policies. But as we start to do this work, and as they start to see resources flow and see what it looks like when they are able to organize, build power, and affect change, and they start to see and feel the impacts of that, then they're more motivated to build power around state policy and even federal policy. And so that's going to be critical, is to building that community power. I would
Mhm.
also say too that we need to think bigger beyond just kind of myopically looking at the environmental or even infrastructure policies themselves, but think about our tax structure, and think
Mhm.
about like how the finance flows are going to make it to these programs, because they can exist and just be starved because there's no finance flow to them. And so we need to be thinking about our funding priorities as a whole, and how do we shift even whether it's the extreme investments of billions of dollars per day in the
Mhm.
military or other things. So we need to be thinking bigger in that sense.
No, I like that point about the finances. So I'm a ex official member of NEJAC's finances and Justice 40 work group, and we talk about a lot of the finances with an EPA. So I would advocate for attendees who can follow up on Jackie's point about, you know, when it comes to FACAs for different federal agencies, if there's like a CEQ finance FACA or OMB finance FACA, we need to be federal advisory councils for. I'm using acronyms. Everybody don't know. There's like a advisory councils that representatives from different stakeholder groups advise that particular agency on an issue. They have many of these committees, these commissions, and they should have finance ones. So we should have our EJ, energy justice, climate justice folks on these various finance FACAs, right? Whether it be
Definitely.
OMB, whether it be CEQ, for any federal agency, commerce, I'm sorry, commerce and just in general, and
Yeah.
be pushing for that. And then even for those of us, and correct me, Jackie, the C4s. So
Hmm.
we should have C4s that are established that are focusing on financing, tax
Exactly.
structure, tax incentives, right? And that gets back to Jelon White Newsom's point yesterday about evolving the EJ movement, and the point that Peggy and others made today. The EJ movement has to evolve. We have to have C4s that talk about financing. So,
Mm-hmm.
and and our durability and sustainability as relates to our engagement of the financing, right? Because we're gonna fund the movement. We have to make sure that our taxpayers' dollars are going to the things that we want to fund, and not things we don't want to see, like the offsets or the giveaways that we see in the Inflation Reduction Act. Go ahead, Mark. You have any thoughts about that?
I'm learning. Keep going.
Okay, yes, sir, yes, sir. So another question,
I'm going to move on that.
that we have to have. I think in general with EJ groups, EJ ally groups, we have to have C4s. I'm not sure how many C4s we currently have, but not enough. And then we have to have an emphasis on financing. We got to get that's part of like the money. The money is funding the problems, right?
Track the money.
I mean, you got to follow the money, track the money, right? And if the money is the part of the problem, then and the thing is, I'm gonna say this way, I'm gonna get to the question. I talk too much. It's taxpayers' money. We're paying to be poisoned. Where our money is being used to poison us.
Yeah.
So we gotta make sure our money is not being used for that. So we gotta be on top of that money. Okay. That's been one of that's a major soapbox of mine. So yes,
and then we got to pay again to protect ourselves from the poison.
Exactly. So it's inefficient use of our dollars. When we're getting poisoned by it, then we got the externalities produced by it, and we had to pay. And then you got Medicaid, Medicare, you're uninsured. Man, it's all connected, everyone. So our money, we have to make sure our money's being used for benefits and for quality life, equity, sustainability, and good public health and good economic opportunity structures, right? So I'm talking too much, but again, we only have two panelists, so I'm like a third panelist and a moderator at the same time. So let me go to this other. Yeah, great conversation. This other question. So going back to Justice40, you have all these federal agencies have pilot programs. So you have Homeland Security has a pilot program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. I think Jackie talked about that a little bit. EPA has about 21 pilot programs. I think 6 state revolving fund, brownfield, Superfund. HUD has some programs, Healthy Homes grants. So what I mean, so we got these pilot programs. What other programs do we need these federal agencies to develop and implement to help deliver, Justice40 benefits to communities with EJ issues? And then just to add to that, what are the ways, I know y'all talked about this, but what are the ways that we can make sure that as those benefits are being defined, that the recognition of justice, that the folks at the front line, fence line voices are, making sure those benefits are they're defining the benefits. So can you Mark, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I think you've inspired me, Dr. Wilson. I think going along
Mark, you're breaking up a little bit.
Ownership.
Well, say it again. You broke a little bit. Say it again. Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead. Say it again.
Oh, okay, cool. I was just saying you inspired me along those lines and following money, and we need to make sure that there are significant programs that work with our community wealth and ownership. We need to be owners in our community, not just the workers. That we need programs that'll push a living wage and good jobs and worker protections, job training, have a just transition, and that won't have the place that others have had in our community. I think those things can really address the issues of massive and growing inequities, financial inequities that we're seeing. I also want to, I talk about this, I really want to see more investment in access to technical assistance. We can't, so many of our frontline EJ, environmental justice, climate justice community groups have a of one, if that, and they're not even paying themselves. And to be able to expect them to have an accountant and a researcher and provide metrics and the analysis, that's not something that's feasible. And so providing the technical assistance, helping to provide ideas of how you can partner, how you can, helping the community come together to be able to, as I have about and still continue to worry about, just fly-by-night, well-financed nonprofits coming into the community, applying, getting the funding, and then us seeing more of the trickle down and none of the ownership. I think that those are a couple of areas I'd like to see more investment in.
You were still breaking up a little bit, Mark, but I'm just kind of restate some of the points you made. Ownership. I think we talked about a little bit in the closing panel yesterday with the corporations. it's great for to have minority contractors and people like I told you about my father's a pipe fitter, get the job, but he's sending the money home to Mississippi. What about the folks who living it when at the pipe with the pipeline? So making sure they have ownership. So and also the word of sovereignty. I know Jackie talks about this, right? Energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, right? And as Marcus talking about building capacity. So what we have to do, and this I think Peggy and others talked about this in the opening plenary, the durability of the movement, the evolution of the movement, we have to build capacity for community groups. And then Mark, I'm 100% with you. I mean, those of you may know old school rap lyrics. There's a rap lyric. Last year you didn't know me, now I'm hot. You all know me. Now, all of a sudden EJ is hot. All that Mark said, all these mom and pop shops popping up, and because they got influence and they got access, they don't even look like the communities. They don't even come from the communities. They're getting funded. It is shocking the number of mom and pop shops they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases, not hundreds of millions, but millions of dollars to do EJ work. When last year, or the last 10 years, Jackie, or last 20 years, they scoffed at EJ work. Some of them established groups, I'm sorry. And then these mom and pop shops, because they got influence and access, and they had the what Dr. Bullis say, the complexion for protection. In this case, they got complexion people comfortable with. That's an issue, folks. So I want to. Oh, we lost Mark. So I just want to make sure folks are. Oh, Mark is coming back. Just make sure people understand those issues. But go ahead, Jackie. Pass the mic to you.
Okay, yeah. So, a couple things. One is, yes, just ditto to what's already been said about ownership for sure. And I think that it would be good if we start to also think ourselves about what ownership looks like in terms of systems for our communities. And so, too often, because we are in emergency management mode, you know, whether it's an actual disaster or not, there's this ongoing disasters in our communities that we're not necessarily thinking about investments in land, for example, investments in local food systems, investments in owning our energy infrastructure, investments in kind of owning some of these infrastructure things, as opposed to kind of, again, just like patching holes. And that's often what, you know, the situation that we find ourselves in. And so it's going to take a bit for us to be able to both patch holes and build longevity and ownership. I would also say too, in terms of just holding these federal agencies responsible for spending, is that we need to look at examples like the Office of Public Participation that FERC is putting up, and then take that hopefully to the next level, that it's public participation, not just in terms of input that people can take or leave, but that how do we actually put teeth to this. And so that's, I really want us to think about what those structures can look like that would be attached to each and every one of these agencies, and attached to the sub-agencies, sub-offices within the agencies, so that we really have community input with teeth, is what I would also say.
Thank you. I want to give people a little bit extra time for lunch today. So this is gonna be the last question, and then lunch is gonna start after this. 12, 12:25, 12:30, and everybody come back at 1 o'clock to go to the next block of afternoon sessions. But last question is a comment from the audience, and thank you again for this question. How can non-environmental justice groups help and energize their communities in terms of environmental justice and helping those frontline, fence line EJ groups? So, Mark, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, thanks, Milan. Thanks for asking that question. In the historical moment that we're in, we can't afford not to be completely intersectional in the work that we're doing. Every group needs to be an anti-racist group. Every group needs to be an EJ group. We don't all need to specialize in that, but we need to be able to use our, as I mentioned earlier, use our unique resources, access, power, privilege, information to build partnerships with those that specialize in your community. And I say this because there are plenty of larger, well-established, civil rights-oriented organizations that may not historically have done environment or climate, but are very concerned about health and jobs and the economy and children. And there are many, as I mentioned, environmental justice orgs that are living on pennies on the dollar with one staff. If a more established organization that has a lawyer or a accountant or a researcher or a grant writer could partner with an historical EJ organization, then we really could see successful partnerships where the money and the investment, the actual investment, not the trickle down benefits, the investment goes to those who are serving the community, and it goes to those who know where the benefits, where the solutions that the community needs because they live in the community and they're from the community. So I would say use what you have to work intersectionally to partner with those who have the need, and have the right to continue to do that work and be strengthened. Thanks for
Thank you,
asking.
Mark. Yep. And last word to Jackie.
Yeah, no, just building on exactly what Mark said, that there are these great multi-solving models that serve as precedent, where there are models where so if a group that works on gender justice or a group that works on formerly incarcerated persons and so forth, returning citizens, I'll give a concrete example of an initiative that we were a part of it was United Methodist Women, it was Grid Alternatives, it was the NAACP, and then a group called the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention, all coming together to do not only an installation of a solar array on transitional housing for women who were moving on from who are survivors of domestic violence, but also training the women, largely Black women, to be able to do solar installations. And then afterwards, those women had financial security, and also involved in that were the training for people who were formerly incarcerated, who were employed in this area. And so not only did the women have a new skill, they had a new job and financial security, and then the house, because energy was one of their biggest bills, was then able to, the Genesee Center was able to repurpose that money back into programming to help more women. So we had financial security, we had gender justice, we had justice for formerly incarcerated persons, we had energy security, we had housing security, all of that in one program. And I'll give another quick example of Laredo, Texas, where similarly we're working with United Methodist Women on a center that was doing work on immigration rights in Laredo that has more days above 100 degrees than Death Valley. And so primarily this organization was serving women and children who were coming through, who were dropped off in these ICE buses in the middle of town without anything. And so and again, their energy bill was the biggest bill. And so we did a solar array there, trained the community to be able to do that. And so again, just multi-solving. So we had immigration rights, we had clean energy, we had financial security, we had all of these in one model.
No, thank you for that. So intersectionality, one-stop shop for holistic. How are you going to address climate change? You address all the social terms of health. You address everything, right? It's one-stop shop. It's intersectional. It's more efficient. It's more effective. It's more impactful. Thank you to our great panelists. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate all the great work you're doing. And hopefully people, again, took some lessons learned, some solutions, some recommendations, some best practices that you can replicate and scale up in the work that you're doing in your communities. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the lunch and see you back again at 1 p.m. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie and Mark.